Today, we're taking a delicious detour into the past to rediscover 10 forgotten classics that once brought our grandparents' dinner tables to life. Get ready for a glimpse into vintage family cooking, dishes that blended frugality, warmth, and old-fashioned American ingenuity. We'll uncover how these meals took shape in local kitchens during eras marked by post-war innovation and budget-friendly creativity, and why they gradually vanished from the modern menu. Number 1. Stuffed green peppers. Grandparents across mid-20th century America often relied on these hearty pepper cups when they needed a satisfying supper that repurposed pantry staples. Typically filled with ground beef, rice, tomato sauce, and diced onions, these peppers were then baked until tender. During the 1930s and 1940s, households learned to stretch ingredients in creative ways, and stuffing vegetables served that goal perfectly. In some areas, cooks added breadcrumbs or substituted barley to adapt to local tastes and budgets. By the 1950s and 1960s, popular food magazines showcased colorful images of stuffed peppers on glossy pages, emphasizing the appeal of a complete meal in one neat package. These old commercials and recipe pamphlets often promoted convenient canned sauces, which saved time in the kitchen for busy homemakers juggling large families. Over the years, though, fresh takes on international cuisine displaced the humble stuffed pepper in many weekly menus. Baby boomers and Gen Xers increasingly sought lighter or more flavorful dishes, pushing aside a classic that once symbolized a comforting family dinner. Today, stuffed peppers occasionally resurface in retro cookbooks or vintage-themed potlucks, serving as a tasty reminder of a golden age when filling dinners revolved around simple produce, a small amount of meat, and the comforting textures of slow oven baking. Number 2, liver and onions. For decades, liver and onions epitomized a nutritious, budget-friendly mainstay that many grandparents believed fortified growing children. In the 1930s, frugality reigned supreme, and organ meats supplied an affordable source of protein and vitamins. Sliced liver, either beef or pork, got dredged in flour, then seared with caramelized onions to mask some of the metallic tang. Dependent on region and personal taste, the dish might include a splash of gravy or a strip of bacon, adding richness to what many baby boomers remember as a once-a-week tradition. By the 1950s and 1960s, advertisements in magazines encouraged homemakers to serve liver as a health-forward choice for strong families. Meanwhile, old Hollywood movies sometimes portrayed this plate as a daily staple for small-town diners and roadside establishments. Over time, the pungent flavor proved off-putting for the younger generation. The 1970s ushered in more fast food options and processed meals, while the 1980s introduced a shift toward leaner cuts of more familiar meats. As Gen X turned toward grilling burgers, chicken, or fish, the market for organ meats dwindled. Liver and onions fell from regular rotation, occupying a small niche on certain diner menus or in the memories of older relatives who still cherish its nostalgic quality. Number 3, tuna noodle casserole. Once a superstar in church potlucks and community gatherings, this budget-savvy meal gained momentum after World War II, when canned tuna and condensed soups became household staples. The recipe featured egg noodles layered with tuna, cream of mushroom soup, vegetables like peas, and sometimes crunchy toppings, such as potato chips or breadcrumbs. Baby boomers recall how these casseroles streamlined cooking, utilizing shelf-stable ingredients that cut down on preparation time. During the 1950s, televised commercials promoted convenience foods as modern achievements, making tuna noodle casserole an icon of the era's innovation. By the 1960s, flavors broadened slightly, with families mixing in cheese or onion rings to create flair. Though the 1970s and 1980s continued to see variations published in local recipe booklets, a cultural turn toward fresher, more sophisticated dishes led many to dismiss this humble classic as bland or heavy. People began seeking globally inspired fare, leaving the once-beloved tuna noodle casserole languishing in old America's memory bank. Even so, it survives in small pockets of nostalgia, particularly during cooler months when comfort food calls for that creamy, carb-laden warmth associated with post-war kitchens. Number 4, tomato aspic. An emblem of mid-century ingenuity, tomato aspic offered a savory gelatin dish that grandmothers proudly presented at Sunday buffets or special celebrations. It often combined tomato juice, unflavored gelatin, onions, celery, and sometimes Worcestershire sauce or Tabasco for a faint kick. Molded into ring shapes or decorative forms, tomato aspic delivered color and novelty to tables during the 1940s through the 1960s, especially in an era enthralled by Jell-O mania and molded salads. Old commercials and cookbooks highlighted it as a refined, elegant option, frequently garnished with mayonnaise or shrimp. Baby boomers might recall biting into the cool, quivering slice topped with lettuce, a distinctive contrast of textures. Yet, as the 1970s progressed, aspiring hosts turned to more international offerings. Think antipasto spreads or layered Mexican dips, and tomato aspic became a relic, rarely fitting contemporary palates. Gen X typically bypassed the gelatin-based savories in favor of fresh salad bars at chain restaurants that spread across the U.S. by the 1980s. Today, this vintage creation endures primarily at certain retro-themed get-togethers or in the photo albums of home cooks who relish the era's obsession with shaping foods into whimsical forms. Number 5, Swiss steak. Contrary to what the name suggests, Swiss steak doesn't hail from Switzerland, but rather refers to the Swissing process of tenderizing tougher cuts of beef by pounding them flat. Traditionally, grandparents would dredge these flattened pieces in flour, then braise them slowly with diced tomatoes, onions, and sometimes bell peppers. This comforting dish surfaced in local diners and home kitchens throughout the 1940s and 1950s, when families needed economical strategies for turning cheaper meat into something succulent. Cookbooks of the time touted Swiss steak as a robust evening meal, well suited for cold months. Early TV cooking demonstrations showcased how easy it was to prepare, even if the recipe demanded a few hours of simmering. Baby boomers might recall waiting patiently in the living room, hearing the gentle bubbling sound of dinner cooking on the stove. Come the 1970s, faster meal solutions like pressure cookers and the rise of processed convenience items began to chip away at Swiss steak's popularity. By the 1980s, interest in exotic or contemporary recipes overshadowed these simpler classics. While it occasionally appears on vintage-themed restaurant menus, many younger individuals remain unfamiliar with its old-world charm, overshadowed by modern steak preparations or global dishes that emphasize quick cooking and bold flavors. Number 6, corned beef hash. An adaptation of leftover corned beef made popular in Irish-American communities. Corned beef hash spread to countless tables from the 1930s through the 1960s. Grandparents who celebrated St. Patrick's Day with a full corned beef and cabbage spread often repurposed the meat by dicing it up with potatoes, onions, and spices. Over medium heat, the mixture sizzled until crisp on the outside while staying tender within. It quickly turned into a cost-effective breakfast, lunch, or dinner, versatile enough to appear at any time of day. By the 1950s, some brands offered canned corned beef hash that capitalized on the allure of quick preparation. Old commercials promoting these cans frequently depicted cheerful home cooks opening a tin and swiftly frying everything to a perfect golden brown. Through the 1970s, families continued to rely on hash as a cozy weekend meal, sometimes served with eggs. But as the American diet began to prioritize lower sodium and fresher meats, corned beef hash slipped in popularity. Many baby boomers remember it as a savory treat that bridged their parents' heritage with the convenience-driven mindset of the post-war years. Now, it tends to surface primarily in nostalgic diners or during holiday leftover transformations, rarely commanding a spot in modern recipe rotations. Number 7, cornbread dressing. While stuffing is often associated with holiday turkeys, cornbread dressing was a beloved side dish, especially in southern regions during the mid-20th century. Families would crumble day-old cornbread, combine it with sautéed onions, celery, poultry seasoning, broth, and sometimes bits of sausage or giblets, then bake it until fluffy yet crisp around the edges. In decades past, baby boomers from rural backgrounds recall the communal ritual of baking a fresh batch of cornbread days before a big gathering, allowing time for it to dry slightly, perfect for absorbing flavorful liquids. During the 1940s and 1950s, older generations regarded cornbread dressing as a frugal, hearty addition to Sunday suppers and holiday feasts alike. By the 1970s, however, packaged stuffing mixes dominated grocery aisles, overshadowing homemade variants that required extra effort. Urbanization and the expansion of chain supermarkets further distanced many people from local traditional recipes. Gen X often grew up with instant stuffings that needed only hot water, bypassing the complexity of scratch-made cornbread dressing. Over time, as cooking trends shifted toward convenience, this rustic side diminished in popularity, remaining primarily in southern states or among families who intentionally preserve their culinary heritage. Number 8, chipped ham barbecue. Popular in certain parts of the country, particularly around western Pennsylvania, chipped ham barbecue thrived from the 1930s through the 1960s as a quick lunch or dinner option. Thinly sliced deli ham, often chipped into paper-thin pieces, simmered in a tangy, sweet barbecue sauce until hot and layered onto soft buns. Baby boomers growing up in that region might recall visiting local delicatessens that specialized in chipped ham, or buying it in large packages for cookouts and family gatherings. Old commercials portrayed chipped ham as a multitasker, equally fitting for sandwiches, casseroles, or party spreads. The barbecue version carried a distinct sweet tart profile thanks to ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and sometimes onions or peppers. As the 1970s progressed, the onslaught of new fast food burger chains, pizza parlors, and globally influenced takeout began to overshadow these community-specific classics. By the 1980s, fewer families regularly relied on chipped ham barbecue, favoring simpler deli meats or more elaborate grilled dishes. Nonetheless, for those who remember it, chipped ham barbecue conjures warm memories of hometown pride and potluck tables lined with warm sandwich trays, capturing a vintage spirit that resonates with local nostalgia more than widespread national popularity. Number 9, salmon patties. Long before salmon was prized for its health benefits, families in the mid-20th century often relied on canned fish to produce quick meals that bridged economy and nutrition. Combining drained salmon, breadcrumbs, onions, and eggs, patties were shaped and fried to achieve a crispy exterior. During the 1940s, rationing rules and budget constraints led home cooks to experiment with accessible proteins. By the 1950s and 1960s, these salmon patties turned into a low-cost way to incorporate seafood into diets, featuring prominently in local recipe swaps and illustrated cookbooks. Baby boomers might recall the sizzling aroma filling the kitchen, accompanied by sides such as creamed peas or mashed potatoes. With the rise of fresh fish availability in the 1970s and 1980s, however, the preference for canned salmon waned, and these patties gradually faded. Many Gen Xers shifted their focus to grilled or baked fillets, adopting seasonings from around the world. In modern times, the resurgence of interest in omega-3 rich foods has brought fresh salmon to the spotlight, while the traditional canned version remains largely overlooked. Salmon patties survive in certain homey diners and the recipe boxes of grandparents who remember them as an economical, satisfying meal for busy weeknights. Number 10, Apple Brown Betty. A warm, comforting dessert that reached widespread popularity in mid-century America. Apple Brown Betty layered sliced apples with sweetened breadcrumbs or crumbled biscuits, then baked until everything turned golden and caramel-like. Its history stretches back to the colonial era, but grandparents in the 20th century continued to refine the recipe, sometimes adding cinnamon, nutmeg, or a drizzle of lemon juice for zing. Baby boomers often saw this dish at Sunday dinners when the family took advantage of seasonal apple harvests. Media advertisements during the 1950s emphasized the convenience of using pre-sliced canned apples, while old radio shows and cooking segments sometimes shared quick tips for a foolproof Brown Betty topping. As the 1960s and 1970s arrived, a growing variety of boxed cake mixes and frozen pies overshadowed older homemade desserts. By the 1980s, consumer culture increasingly favored novelty treats, snack foods, and elaborate desserts that promised layers of flavor or bold presentation. Apple Brown Betty began to feel dated, overshadowed by everything from elaborate layer cakes to international pastries. Nevertheless, it still ignites fond recollections among people who remember the toasty breadcrumbs mingling with sweet apples, reminiscent of a time when dessert didn't require fancy frostings or complicated techniques. Just good fruit, simple spices, and the familiar comfort of vintage, oven-baked treats.